We grew up in a household of five siblings, and Olivia being the oldest, me being the second oldest. Olivia was a beautiful person, inside and out. She was just very loving and caring. We're less than a year apart, so when I graduated, I moved out of my mom's house and moved with Olivia and her husband. My sister wanted to bring me under her wing, basically show me how to find a job.
I would always call her Fabulous Olivia. So this is probably one of those moments. She got the shades on, the drink, got her nails done, and the swimsuit. So this was just Olivia being fabulous. I know she was my sister-in-law, but I always said she was my sister because we talked about everything.
Olivia went into the tax business where she became very successful.
She was just always into something that was business-oriented.
This is when Olivia first became a mom. This is my sister Courtney. This is Olivia. This is my mother when she had short hair. And this is Ariel.
Mom looks so young. She looks so young. It was pretty cool growing up. We used to go camping a lot, going swimming, climbing trees and stuff like that. She always made sure that we had everything. Basically a kid's like fantasy.
The divorce with her and Al was very upsetting to her, very disappointing. I feel like it also made her insecure in areas. And she was still just trying to make sure that her and the girls were good.
She really had to start over. She definitely did want to meet someone new. She wanted to get that family aspect back.
She seemed reluctant, to kind of move forward. But, I told her, I say, hey, you got to put yourself out there. You need to date, have fun again.
I knew that she wanted to find someone that was actually going to love her and just be all for her.
When I first heard the news that Olivia had met someone, I welcomed it because I want to see her happy.
She always talked about how cute he was, and he has a good job.
He worked for the state of Texas as a prison guard. You would think that as a prison guard, they would be some type of protector for their families, for sure. As long as I can remember, as a kid growing up, we used to have football Sundays where on a Sunday you come together, you come at somebody's house, and there's a lot of good food to eat and there's a lot of good football to watch.
Football Sundays at my in-laws. I had never seen anything like it until I married into this family. We would go straight after church and stay there until like 10 o'clock, sometimes later. Everybody will still be there, be a packed house.
Just a lot of good family time and got a lot of good family fun, and Olivia was the centerpiece of all of that.
First time I met Chris, I remember Miss Anita offering him, which is my mother-in-law, offering him some food. Olivia was sitting next to him, and he said, yeah, you can go fix me something to eat. He told Olivia to go and fix the food. And I just kind of brushed it off. I said, well, maybe he's just one of those guys, very old school.
The first time I met Christopher, his whole dynamic was just off to me. When you talk to him, he comes off as arrogant. He is a know-it-all. And he used to tell me all the time, like, oh, I'm gonna marry your mom and all this stuff. And yeah, I would be like, no, you're not. Like, no, you're not. And I would run and tell my mom, like, no, you're not gonna marry this man. Please don't marry this man.
Early on in their relationship, Olivia and Christopher Jones had went out to a local restaurant in Beaumont, Texas one night. There was a young lady that Christopher Jones had been dating before. He got upset and started an altercation with Olivia.
We just happened to be there, and I guess this was a first date for them. And then we see these girls just jumping Olivia. It was 3 of them, and she was by herself. And one took off her shoe and was hitting Olivia in the head with it. You had one holding her, and the other one was just kind of fighting. Chris, and this is something I'll never forget, is not doing anything. I remember him laughing with his 2 friends.
At the time, the police was called, and of course, that's when Christopher Jones really tucks his tail and runs.
And I just remember Olivia getting in her Suburban at the time, and she was blood and was red and was crying a whole lot. And I remember trying to tell her, Olivia, calm down. And she was like, no, I want to go home. After the fight happened, I did contact Olivia. I said, you need to press charges.
But Chris told her to not file a police report because he was working at the prison at that time. So he didn't want it to come back on him. I never had a good feeling from Chris. Never. But she didn't see that.
Myself, my wife, and my kids, and Olivia and her children were at a local park here in Beaumont, Texas. We had been at the park playing and catching up. Noticed that my sister's phone kept ringing, but she would never answer it. And it would ring back to back to back, basically, and she would never pick up the phone. Olivia and her kids had got into her car, and all of a sudden we see a truck kind of fly into the parking lot.
And I was like, well, who is this? And then I see Chris jump out the truck, leave his door open, and I see him punching her glass window. Like, he kept punching it, and at this point, Josh, he sees what's going on.
When I seen him bamming on the window, I immediately started running up to the situation with my wife grabbing me, trying to hold me back.
And I just remember pulling my husband's shirt because I'm like, we got the kids right here, and I'm telling the kids, y'all stay right there. And then at the same time, I'm on the phone with 911. And I see Olivia crying and screaming, please stop, Chris, please stop.
I heard my Aunt Brittany say, I'm gonna call 911, I'm calling 911 right now. And that's when he jumped in his truck and he sped off. And I remember him speeding off because he turned the corner so fast it looked like the truck was gonna flip.
And at this point, my kids are hysterical. And I looked over and Yalia and Ariel weren't crying. When I noticed that, I instantly said, oh, they've seen this before.
When I got up to the vehicle, and Olivia was crying in the seat. And at that point, that's when Olivia shut down. And she didn't want to talk about it.
After that altercation, it did change our relationship with Olivia. She stopped talking to us for about a year.
Looking back at it, I should have pressed it more. He isolated her, made her feel like the only people that was there for her was his side of the family.
They didn't try to justify it. They just said that they were going to counseling, that he was getting better, and he would basically never do it again. Turn around. Ooh!
I believe when Olivia cut us off around that time, she was in love with Chris. She was embarrassed by what he had done. And I think she wanted everyone to believe that their relationship was good. They were in a good space. From the conversations we had with my mother-in-law, the family, you know, just thought Chris was just this really good guy. But me and Josh, my husband, we knew the truth, and we knew he had a dark side.
Love you. I'm gonna love you. I'm gonna protect you with my life. But only one way I can do it. You gotta be my wife.
Come on. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Come on, baby. Come on. Say yes.
I just remember seeing on social media that he proposed to her and they got engaged.
When she told us, I didn't have no words.
I think she considered, you know, this will make sure my girls are taken care of.
I didn't want him to be my stepdad, and I didn't want him in my life.
Olivia told me about Ariel having her reservations. And like I told her, you have to listen to your child. But she felt like it was because Ariel didn't want to see her move on with someone besides her dad.
As long as he made it seem like he was changing, that he was gonna make everything right, then she was gonna stick beside him. The Beauty and the Beast, but without the beast changing.
Deep down in my heart, I was very confused. I was wondering, what is it about this man that she's so drawn to? Why does she feel like him controlling her is love? And I was honestly very frightened for her and the girls. I was very afraid.
It was hell, basically. Chris definitely brought the prison to his house. He ran it like a prison. He oversaw it as a prison. So everything had to be done at a certain time, by a certain way. Rooms had to be clean at all times. We couldn't have literally anything on the floor. The beds had to be made. It couldn't have no wrinkles or anything in the comforter. Like, everything had to be straight, and like you had to literally take your hand and straighten out the blankets. Pillows had to be nice and neat. If we had the TV on, and if he didn't like what was on the TV, he'd either make us cut it off or he'd make us change it. If you weren't in the room during the day, the door had to be open. So that way, if anyone came down the hallway, they would see how nice and neat everything was. The dishes had to be done every night, washed. The floors had to be cleaned every night. The rugs had to be cleaned every night. And his number one rule was like, whatever happens in this house stays in this house. One day, my mom called me into the kitchen and I told her, hey, like, I'll be right there. And he actually whooped me with the belt because he said that I shouldn't talk to my mom like that. It was a very difficult situation to be in. I feel like people need to know what's going on, especially like your family. And if they know what's going on, then they can help you. My mom and her mom talked every morning. And when she passed, it basically took away her other half. Chris tried to make it seem like he cared. He tried to make it seem like, oh, he was just so devastated. My mother-in-law passed away, you know, but in all honesty, he really didn't care.
In our culture, and someone passed away, of course, everyone navigated to that house. And I just noticed that Chris was never there.
After my mother-in-law passed away, we got really, really close. And I just remember she called me and I remember her whispering. And I said, why are you whispering? And she said, girl, because he got them cameras in there and I don't want him to hear what I'm saying. And I was like, huh?
There were a total of 10 cameras. There were 2 in the front. Then they had one pointing towards the hallway right above the front door. He had another one in the corner of the living room, so you can see the full living room and the kitchen. Like every inch of the house was covered in cameras except for our bedrooms and the bathroom.
That was just real creepy for me. You have no privacy, you know. Olivia can't have a decent conversation without, you know, him knowing about it.
He could look at the cameras anytime he wanted to. He can also talk through the cameras and we can actually talk to him back. So if while he was at work and he seen that we were in a hallway or something, he can actually talk through it. And there were also night vision. Everything was very disturbing. Because if you were living in a house, then you would know, like, this should not be happening. You're not supposed to be living in fear. One night, Chris and my mom were in the room arguing. The door was shut. And all I could hear was like, Chris, I can't breathe. Chris, I can't breathe. And I opened the door and I said, Mama, are you okay? And the door quickly slammed. And it slammed so fast that it hit my forehead. He came out and he started yelling at me. He started putting his finger right here on my forehead and like pushing me back. And I was like, you think I'm just gonna let you put your hands on my mom? And she's telling me, she's screaming out she can't breathe. Are you crazy? I said, Mom, are you really gonna let him do this to you? Why are you doing this? Why are you allowing him to do this? And she basically said, Ariel, when I feel like enough is enough, then I'm gonna leave. And I said, are you serious? You're really gonna sit up here and let him continue to do this to you? He knew it. He knew that she wouldn't leave him as long as he said the right words. I didn't want them to get married. It took everything out of me not to object during the wedding. But I seen how her face was so lit up. She had the biggest smile on her face. You should have seen her, like her heart was so, it was so happy. I didn't want to be the one to ruin that for her, because she had so many hopes, she had so many dreams to be a wife, to be a mother, to live in a stable household. I didn't want to ruin that fantasy for her.
And she came and she hugged us both and she was crying just to see us there. And she said, I'm just so happy to see y'all here because, you know, her sisters weren't there.
It was sad that my siblings weren't there. It was strictly because Chris did not want them there and they didn't feel welcome.
Chris wasn't going to accept anything that wasn't his way. If it was either his way or the highway. And if he said he didn't want someone there, then that person was not going to be there. He would get into fights at work. And his problems was he didn't know how to control his anger. He also brought recordings back to the house. The surveillance footage that he showed me showed him beating up the inmates so bad that he couldn't even move. They had to transport him to the ER with all his injuries. I couldn't look at that. It was too much for me. I've never seen that type of anger before in my whole life. He showed us so that way we can get in line also, to show like this is what he do to people that don't follow his rules. Chris was having troubles with his job. He was on suspension.
Olivia at that point had built up a clientele base where she had tons of clients utilizing her tax business. Seeing our family kind of struggle, it created an ambition within her for her to go out and want better in life.
She definitely made probably 2-3 times more than he did.
Olivia and Chris, what they did was start another business, which was a food truck business. So Olivia took the money that she earned and invested it into the food truck to get it up and going and get it running. And that way Olivia can continue to do what she was doing.
The idea, I would say, was his. But she was the one that was doing all the work. She was the one going to buy the food, prep the food, make sure the labels and stuff was correct. She made it seem like he did all the work. When in reality, the only thing he did was load the truck and cook the food. That was it. He just had her by the collar and just whatever he wanted, she was gonna go do. So graduating high school, I just knew that I was about to go to college. I was about to be free. And I just had a big sigh of relief of me finally getting away from that house. But it also scared me because I had to leave them behind. Not only my mom, but my sister. That wasn't how things were supposed to go. And yeah. On February 13th of 2019, I had a feeling that I need to talk to my mom and just let her know, like, hey, I love you. I'm gonna bring you your Valentine's Day gift up here tomorrow. After that phone call, I was a little uneasy, and that whole night I could not sleep. I just had a feeling like something was gonna happen, like something was off, but I just couldn't put my finger on it.
Beaumont 911, what is the address of your emergency?
I'm at home. My wife is shot at me. Please, her. Please, please. My wife, please.
On February 14th, I got a call from Chris around 9:12 in the morning, and he was basically saying, hey Ariel, something happened.
Come this way.
Okay.
Please, come this way. This way. Okay. Please. Olivia!
Okay.
Baby!
Sir. Okay. Step back. Step back.
What's up, Mr. Butler?
I was like, is she okay? Like, what's going on? And he was like, Ariel, it don't look good.
Yes.
What happened?
We had a disagreement. And I say, baby, if you're not working with me, you're working against me. I say, we've been doing this. My 19-year-old stepdaughter was 8. My 11-year-old was 1. I say, Olivia, if we can't get it together, we can't be together.
Okay.
We got several bleach. And I say, I just want a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And her reaction was, and I've been saying this for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
And her reaction was, if you don't want me, I'm gonna kill myself.
And he said that she ran in the house and got the gun, and she put it up to her head, and she was telling him, if I can't have you, nobody can have you.
We got a loaded gun on the side of the bed. We got a loaded shotgun in the corner where the video games is.
And he said that when he was trying to get the gun, that it accidentally went off.
I said, give me the gun. She like, I don't remember which hand. I'm like, give me that gun. What is you doing? Stop trying to scare me.
Uh-huh.
I took it.
So when you grabbed it, it went off?
She yanked. I grabbed it and she yanked back. And the gun went off.
Okay.
The gun went off.
All right.
And I did the best I could.
What's your last name?
Jones.
I got there in a matter of 15 minutes. I drove around the corner, all I seen was cops, and I seen the caution tape. The police officers, they stopped me, and I was just like, I just want to see her. I went to his mom and I asked her, like what's going on? Is she okay? Like, is she alive? And she had the same face Chris had, blank. And she said, Ariel, she's not alive. And I broke down.
I pulled up to a site that I thought I would never see, with police everywhere, with detectives everywhere, with crime scene tape everywhere. I pulled up to a nightmare.
When I got on scene, Olivia's car was in the driveway. Her keys were on the trunk of her car. Her phone was inside of her car. There was cold food product in her car, hamburger meat, things of that nature. There was a bouquet of flowers in the car that seemed to have been there for Valentine's Day. It seemed like she was in the middle of something that morning, and it got interrupted by this incident. We made our way through the house to find Olivia, and she was deceased in her bedroom. She was lying on the floor on her stomach, partially clothed. There was a great deal of blood. There was blood spatter. It wasn't until we rolled her over and saw an exit wound coming out of her left eye that we realized that the round had actually struck her in the back of the head. Something that we did notice throughout the home were cameras, surveillance cameras. So we were hopeful we would be able to get some information from those cameras. Absolutely nothing on that scene pointed to a woman that was suicidal or depressed or intending on taking her life that day.
They're waiting for the lead detectives. They're going to be the ones that actually interview you, so.
We first met with Christopher Jones at the Beaumont Police Department. He agreed to speak with us, seemed very willing to do so, wanted us to know what he said had happened. They were preparing the food truck. Sometime during that preparation, he grew upset because he felt that Olivia was not doing her share of the work, had failed him and was not keeping up where she should.
There's no reason that certain things wouldn't be done. I am very particular. If you heard that, that's true. I am very particular.
You strive for the best for people.
I work really hard, and I don't make excuses for myself, and I don't accept excuses for anybody else.
So because of these things, he decided he wanted to get a divorce. She stormed into the house, went straight to the bedroom, put a gun to her head.
What did you say?
Really? Are you serious? Really? This is not going to solve anything.
Okay.
You know, this is not, you do not want to do that. Put that freaking gun down before you make a mistake and hurt yourself. She was crying. She was crying.
Well, during this time, we happened to ask him about the surveillance cameras around his house. We asked if we could have permission to view those on his phone. He was very willing to allow us access to those cameras.
Say you want to access just that camera. You touch that, and that's just that camera.
Okay.
You follow what I'm saying?
So far, let's go back to devices.
Yes, sir.
And
everything is labeled.
Carport, backyard, front door, back door, laundry room, inside garage, living room, kitchen.
But the videos weren't there.
Why would there be no recordings on that?
I don't know. It should be. But like I said, the internet, you can go through days and it pretty much does, we shouldn't have bought that. You just keep, like, you can pick whatever day you want and it's never going to be consistent. That's why I say it was a waste of money.
There was a change in Christopher's demeanor. He wouldn't look us in the eye.
Well, I'm wanting desperately to find some video on here that corroborates what you're telling us, but almost all the videos start right after this event happened.
His immediate reaction was that the system was faulty. He told me that he had been lazy in charging the cameras.
I was scared. I was scared.
Hey, have you been honest with me today?
Yes, ma'am. I was confused.
Look me in the eye.
I was confused about a lot of things.
Look me in the eyes. If you've been honest with me today, tell me how many videos you deleted.
It was obvious that he was being very deceptive.
If I deleted those videos, I look guilty.
Not if you say right now, or you just say a while ago, I freaked out, I panicked, I did some stuff I shouldn't have done. Is that one of them?
Yes.
How many did you delete?
I don't know, honestly.
Okay.
How many had he deleted? And come to find out, everything except one camera. The only video that we saw around the time of the incident was the one showing that Olivia didn't go storming through the house. She didn't go to the bedroom, none of those things. She was actually in the kitchen, washing up, cleaning up from preparing food. Christopher was in the kitchen as well. He's the one that walked toward the bedroom first. He stopped in the hallway. When Olivia walked around to go toward the bedroom, she was startled to find him there. When that video ended, it was less than 3 minutes later that Christopher was on the phone with 911 saying that his wife was shot in the head.
I'm at home, my wife was shot in the leg. Please hurry, please, please. My wife, please!
I think the reason that one camera was still there is he ran out of time. When Christopher was supposed to be saving his wife's life, he was out in the front yard deleting videos. By the time that interview had ended that day, Christopher was placed under arrest for murder.
And there were several videos shown during that trial that showed him being an absolute monster to my sister. It was like a nightmare living that trial.
Then you're gonna be looking stupid. Look on the floor. Look on the floor. Look on the floor, White. Look on the floor. Look on the floor. Look on the floor. Look on the that is how why is that like that? You're not paying attention. What the is? You wasn't worried about the son of a bitch a minute ago. That's your mother. No! Look at me like that, bitch. I'm not playing with you, lazy. You want to do something, not enough? Give it here. You got all the goddamn answers. You don't do a goddamn thing around this right. This your ass, bitch. That's clean dish. That's clean.
I didn't want to, they fell on the floor, so I didn't want to reuse them.
You look at this. You don't pay attention what the you doing. You all over the place, Olivia. You ain't got the chance to claim your home. Food on the wall. Who you burning now?
Me.
Area don't live here. It's you. It's always been you.
Once I seen the video footage, I was just filled with sadness, so much sadness. I felt guilt as to why didn't I see that? Why didn't I know that she was dealing with it was just this bad? You know, why didn't I say something when I could have?
Typically, the victim will make excuses for the violent person. The victim will think that they can fix the violent person. And either way, they think that they're in love with the violent person. Once violence begins, it doesn't just stop.
Act like you ain't got no patience. You want to have a kid? I'll about my kid.
And I'm going to get emotional. It breaks your heart that she went through what she went through. It hurts to know that she, for whatever reason, could not remove herself from that relationship. And but for that, she would still be here today.
I can honestly say he took a piece of everyone's heart, everyone's soul. He crushed it.
Every day I put on this ribbon, this purple ribbon, I put that ribbon on every day in remembrance of her. And it signifies domestic violence. So I wear it every single day. I love her and I miss her dearly. It's a nightmare. Think about her all the time.
I want my mom to be remembered as that happy thought that everyone has, that place they go to when they need peace, joy, happiness. She deserved more, you know, like a smile that you see on everyone's face, like that's her. That food that you love, that's her. The one that makes your soul smile, that's how I want her to be remembered.
The following is the first installment of our cinematic deep dive. This is section 1 of 11. The air in London on that Tuesday in 1992 didn't smell like spring. It smelled like ozone, wet asphalt, and the creeping metallic tang of a storm that refused to break. You could feel it in your marrow, a city on edge, holding its breath as the IRA's mainland campaign turned the financial district into a labyrinth of nerves. Every unattended bag was a potential death warrant, every siren a heartbeat of collective anxiety. But the blast that shattered the morning at 8:42 a.m. near the Baltic Exchange wasn't just another headline in a decade of violence. It was the birth of a mystery that would haunt the yard for 34 agonizing years. Imagine the sound, a roar so profound it didn't just hurt your ears. It rearranged your heartbeat. A physical blow that felt like the earth itself had been cracked open by an angry god. Glass didn't just break. It atomized, turning into a million diamond-edged daggers that sliced through the mundane routine of office workers reaching for their first coffee, turning a Tuesday morning into a jagged, crimson nightmare. In the center of that swirling gray hell, where the dust of pulverized Victorian brick hung heavy like a funeral shroud, stood the silhouette of a man who would become the face of justice and eventually the face of the ultimate betrayal. Arthur Sterling, then a rising star in the Metropolitan Police, a man with eyes like flint and a jawline that suggested unshakable integrity, stood amidst the debris. His coat was covered in the fine, white powder of a fallen empire, his lungs filling with the toxic breath of the city's heart, his eyes fixed on the epicenter where 3 lives had just been extinguished in a heartbeat of fire. But as the smoke cleared, the questions began to metastasize like a cancer. This wasn't a standard device. The signature was wrong. The timing was too precise. And as the sirens wailed a dissonant, screaming chorus across the Thames, the first seeds of a cold case were sown in the very soil of the investigation itself. The community was paralyzed, a collective tremor running through the pubs of East End to the mahogany boardrooms of Canary Wharf. How could this happen? How could the most watched square mile on the planet, the Ring of Steel, go dark at the exact moment the detonator flipped? The security net hadn't just failed, it had been unraveled. There was a strange clue found in the smoking wreckage, something that didn't belong in the arsenal of a street-level cell, a high-grade military encryption chip, scorched but identifiable, a piece of technology that whispered of state secrets rather than revolutionary fervor. It was a phantom piece of evidence that Sterling himself logged into the system, only for it to fall victim to a mysterious disappearance from the evidence locker 3 days later. London 1992 was a city of shadows, but this shadow was darker than the rest. People looked at their neighbors with suspicion, the community shock deepening as the realization set in that the enemy might not be across the sea, but across the street. The victims, a young courier whose bike was found twisted like a piece of modern art, a father of 4 who had stopped to tie his shoe, and a secretary on her very first day of work, became ghosts that refused to rest. Their names were plastered on every tabloid, their lives dissected in the cold light of day, yet the man who pulled the trigger remained a cipher. The investigation launched with the fury of 1,000 suns, a whirlwind of forensic teams and intelligence officers, yet every lead felt like it had been pre-severed. Arthur Sterling walked the perimeter of the blast zone like a priest at a desecrated altar. He was the one who found the primary witness, a trembling flower girl who swore she saw a man in a tan trench coat walking calmly away from the heat, moving against the tide of screaming victims with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly where the blind spots in the security cameras were. This man didn't look back. He didn't run. He simply evaporated into the London fog. Sterling took the statement, nodded with a grim, paternal sympathy, and then the statement vanished. The strange clue of the witness testimony was buried under a mountain of bureaucratic red tape, hidden by the very man the public was looking to for salvation. The atmosphere in the city changed that day. It wasn't just the fear of the next bomb. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of an unsolved crime that felt deliberate. The Ring of Steel was supposed to be impenetrable, a fortress of surveillance and checkpoints, yet the 1992 bomber had moved through it like a ghost. This was the start of the deadlock, the beginning of a 34-year silence that would only be broken when the technology of the future caught up with the crimes of the past. As we peel back the layers of this cold case, we find ourselves staring into a void where the line between the protector and the predator is blurred beyond recognition. Every brick in the Baltic Exchange seemed to hold a secret, every survivor's memory a fragmented piece of a puzzle that Sterling was carefully dismantling even as he pretended to build it. The shock didn't fade. It hardened into a cynical resentment. The families of the victims held vigils, their candles flickering against the cold wind of the Thames, demanding answers that the police files claimed didn't exist. But the files were lying. The evidence wasn't gone, it was just waiting. The ghost bombing wasn't a failure of intelligence, it was a masterpiece of internal sabotage. And as we look back at those first chaotic hours, we see the beginning of a lie so grand it would take 3 decades and a digital revolution to finally expose the man who stood at the center of the smoke, pretending to be a hero while the world burned around him. The narrative of 1992 is often told as a story of a city under siege, but the true story, the one that would eventually lead to the community shock of the decade, is about the silence that followed the roar. It's about the way the light hit the shattered glass, and the way a young detective realized he could use the chaos to carve out a kingdom. The investigation wasn't stalled by a lack of clues. It was choked by a surplus of them, all leading to a door that Arthur Sterling had the only key to. This was no ordinary tragedy. It was a cold-blooded calculation, a strange clue in the history of British policing that would remain unread until the ghosts finally decided to speak. The tension in the air back then was thick enough to choke you. You could see it in the faces of the officers on the beat, the way they gripped their truncheons a little tighter, the way they looked at the crowds with a mixture of fear and loathing. But Sterling was different. He was calm. He was the anchor in the storm. People trusted him because they had to. If the man leading the hunt for the 1992 bomber wasn't the pinnacle of virtue, then the city was truly lost. And so, the lie took root. It grew in the cracks of the broken pavement, nourished by the blood of the innocent and the silence of the complicit. The 1992 cold case wasn't a mystery to everyone. To some, it was a successful operation. To Sterling, it was the first step toward a legacy built on the ashes of the very people he was sworn to protect. As the sun set on that first horrific day, the smoke from the Baltic Exchange drifted over the river, a dark omen of the decades of deception to come. The investigation was officially underway, but the truth had already been buried in a shallow grave, covered by the very man who promised to find it. This was the birth of a haunting, a lingering shock that would stay in the bones of the community until the day the handcuffs finally clicked shut on a retired legend. The smoke never really cleared. It just waited for the wind to change. The sirens hadn't even stopped screaming when the first paper trail began to dissolve. By the time the clock struck midnight on that first day, the 1992 Baltic Exchange bombing had already been steered into a labyrinth of dead ends, a masterpiece of procedural sabotage orchestrated from the very top. Inside the incident room at New Scotland Yard, the air was a thick, choking fog of stale coffee, burnt tobacco, and the frantic energy of 100 detectives trying to catch a ghost. Maps were pinned to corkboards, red string connecting the dots of a conspiracy that Arthur Sterling was carefully untangling before it could even form. He was the conductor of this dissonant orchestra, standing at the center of the chaos, his sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, projecting the image of a man who wouldn't sleep until the monster was caught. But every order he barked, every lead he prioritized, was a calculated move to bury the strange clue that could have ended his career before it truly began. The investigation was a beast that needed to be fed, and Sterling fed it junk. He directed his best forensic teams to focus on the Irish connection, flooding the streets of Kilburn and Camden with dawn raids that yielded nothing but resentment and broken doors. It was a classic diversion, a sensational, high-profile hunt that kept the headlines screaming and the public's eyes fixed firmly on the usual suspects. Meanwhile, the real evidence, the forensic anomalies that suggested a much more sophisticated, internal actor, was being quietly lost in the system. The high-grade military encryption chip, that piece of technology that whispered of state-sanctioned shadows, wasn't just misplaced. It was wiped from the evidence log by a hand that knew exactly which keys to press. This was the first major mysterious disappearance of the case, not of a person, but of the truth itself. The community shock was being managed, molded into a weapon of fear that Sterling could use to justify his unorthodox methods. Witnesses were the next problem. In the wake of a blast that powerful, memory is a fragile thing, a shattered mirror that reflects whatever light is thrown upon it. Sterling knew this better than anyone. He personally interviewed the flower girl, the one who had seen the man in the tan trench coat. He didn't intimidate her. He did something far more effective. He sympathized with her. He told her that the mind plays tricks in moments of trauma, that the man she saw was likely a hallucination born of the shockwave. He spoke with a paternal softness that made her doubt her own eyes. By the time he was done, her official statement was a mess of contradictions, a vague and unreliable account that was buried deep within a 30-pound file. He didn't just silence her, he made her believe she was crazy. This was the hallmark of the cold case in its infancy, the deliberate erosion of human memory to protect a professional reputation. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation hit a wall of silence that Sterling himself had built. The ghost leads began to proliferate. Anonymous tips, likely generated by Sterling's own operatives, pointed toward international mercenaries, Middle Eastern cells, and rogue intelligence agents. Each of these leads required weeks of international coordination, thousands of man-hours, and dozens of useless flight manifests to cross-check. It was a paper-thin charade, a carousel of busywork that kept the hungry young detectives from looking too closely at the ring of steel security logs from the morning of the blast. Those logs, the ones that showed a specific patrol car being diverted 2 blocks away from the exchange just 5 minutes before the explosion, didn't just disappear. They were overwritten, a technical glitch in the newly digitized system that Sterling had helped implement. The tension in the city was a living thing, a vibrating cord that threatened to snap. Every time a car backfired, people dove for cover. The community shock had transformed into a low-grade, constant paranoia. And Sterling was there to comfort them on the 6 o'clock news, his face a mask of stern resolve. "We are following several significant leads," he would tell the cameras, his voice a soothing baritone that promised safety while delivering deception. He was a master of the vivid, fast-paced soundbite, the kind that made people feel like the police were inches away from an arrest. In reality, they were miles away, and Sterling was the one moving the goalposts. He was creating a narrative where the failure to catch the bomber wasn't a failure of the police, but a testament to how sophisticated and evil the enemy was. It was a brilliant, terrifying play. The more he failed, the more power he was given to fix the system. The forensic laboratory was the only place Sterling couldn't fully control, and it was there that a young technician named Sarah Jenkins found something she shouldn't have. Amidst the tons of debris brought back from the Baltic Exchange, she discovered a microscopic trace of a chemical stabilizer, one used exclusively in British military-grade explosives, specifically those tested at the Porton-Down facilities. It was a strange clue, a jagged piece of the puzzle that didn't fit the IRA profile. When she brought this to Sterling, expecting a promotion or a commendation, he didn't look excited. He looked at her with a cold, predatory stillness that made the hair on her neck stand up. He took the report, thanked her for her diligence, and by the next morning, Sarah Jenkins had been transferred to a quiet desk job in a different borough. The report was never seen again. The chemical trace was dismissed as environmental contamination from the construction equipment on site. This was how the cold case was forged, not by a lack of clues, but by the systematic incineration of them. The investigation became a hollow shell, a ritual of activity that produced no results. The detectives on the ground felt it. They felt the deadlock like a physical weight. They knew they were being led in circles, but they couldn't see the hand on the leash. Sterling was always one step ahead, always ready with a new intelligence report from a confidential source that would send them chasing shadows in the opposite direction. He was building his legend on the graves of the victims, using the 1992 bombing as a stepping stone to the highest reaches of the yard. The mysterious disappearance of the evidence was just the beginning of a 34-year lie that would redefine the meaning of betrayal. The psychological toll on the community was immense. The families of the courier, the father, and the secretary were left in a limbo of grief. They were invited to the yard for progress updates, where Sterling would hold their hands and tell them that justice is a slow process, but we are relentless. He would look them in the eye, knowing he was the reason their loved one's killer was still walking the streets, and he wouldn't blink. That was the most chilling detail of all, his total lack of empathy, his ability to treat human lives like collateral in a grand game of professional chess. The strange clue of the military explosive wasn't just a lead. It was proof that the bombing wasn't an act of war, but an act of policy. A controlled tragedy designed to trigger a massive influx of funding and surveillance powers for a police force that felt it was losing its grip on the city. By the end of the first year, the Baltic Exchange bombing was officially being moved to the unsolved drawer. The sensational headlines had moved on to other tragedies, other scandals. The public, exhausted by the lack of progress, began to accept the ghost bomber narrative. The community shock had scabbed over into a dull ache. But for the people who lived in the shadow of the exchange, the silence was louder than the blast. They knew something was wrong. They knew the police should have been able to find a man in a tan trench coat in the most monitored city in the world. The mystery wasn't that the killer got away. The mystery was why the hunt had stopped just as it was getting warm. Sterling's rise continued unabated. He was the man who survived the blast, the hero who stood in the smoke and didn't flinch. He used the failure of the 1992 case to argue for more power, more technology, more black ops capability to ensure that such a terrorist success would never happen again. He was building a fortress, and he was the only one who knew that the foundation was made of secrets and blood. The cold case was his masterpiece, a perfectly preserved crime that he could keep in a dark corner of his mind, a reminder of his own power to manipulate reality itself. Every time he walked past the site of the bombing, he didn't feel guilt. He felt a sense of ownership. But even a master of deception cannot control the future. He couldn't foresee the day when digital archives would be more resilient than paper ones. He couldn't foresee the day when a young analyst would find a corrupted file and realize it was actually a hidden map of his own treachery. For 34 years, the 1992 case remained a haunting presence in London, a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. It was a mysterious disappearance of justice that left a hole in the heart of the city, a hole that Sterling had filled with his own ambition. As the years bled into decades, the deadlock seemed permanent, a testament to a perfect crime. But the truth is a patient hunter. It doesn't need to run. It just needs to wait for the man who thinks he's escaped to stop looking behind him. The smoke of 1992 was still there, thin and cold, waiting for a single spark to turn it back into a fire that would consume the legend of Arthur Sterling. The atmosphere of the investigation in those early years was a mix of desperate hope and growing cynicism. The detectives were young, hungry, and believed in the badge. They didn't know they were being used as pawns in a game. They didn't even know they were playing. They didn't know that every late night they spent cross-referencing fingerprints was a waste of time because the fingerprints they needed had already been wiped from the system. They didn't know that the strange clue of the encryption chip was the key to a door they weren't allowed to open. They were good men and women working for a man who had sold his soul for a seat at the table of power. And as they hit the deadlock, as the leads dried up and the case went cold, They carried that failure with them like a scar, never realizing that the man who shared their grief was the one who had inflicted the wound. As the calendar flipped into the early 2000s, the world was preoccupied with a new brand of global terror, and the 1992 Baltic Exchange bombing was relegated to a dusty file labeled historical. This was the era of the lost decade, a period where the cold case almost slipped into the abyss of forgotten history. For Arthur Sterling, now a commander with a chest full of commendations and a direct line to the Home Office, this was exactly what he had planned. The smoke had cleared, the headlines were yellowed, and the public's memory was short. But within the walls of New Scotland Yard, the file didn't just sit there, it breathed. It was a ticking clock that only Sterling could hear. He had become a master of the administrative burial, a technique where he would periodically move the physical and digital evidence between departments, ensuring that no single investigator could ever build a comprehensive timeline. Each transfer was a mysterious disappearance of context, a subtle pruning of the truth that made the case seem more unsolvable with every passing year. But the deadlock wasn't as absolute as Sterling hoped. In 2004, a persistent detective named Marcus Thorne, a man whose father had been one of the first responders to the 1992 blast, began poking around the unsolved archives. Thorne didn't have the sophisticated AI of the future. He had something more dangerous, an obsession. He began to notice a pattern in the strange clue of the missing evidence. It wasn't just that things were gone, it was that they always vanished during Sterling's watch. Every time a new forensic technique emerged, DNA profiling, advanced ballistics, digital reconstruction, Sterling would conveniently order a top-to-bottom audit of the evidence lockers, and inevitably, a key piece of the 1992 file would be misplaced during the move. Thorne began to suspect that the cold case wasn't a failure of the police, it was a success of the criminal. The atmosphere during this decade was one of quiet, suffocating suppression. Sterling didn't use a hammer to silence dissent, he used a silencer. When Thorne requested a formal review of the Baltic Exchange forensic reports, he wasn't threatened. Instead, he was promoted to a high-pressure, low-impact unit in a remote corner of the UK, a career move that looked like a reward but felt like an exile. This was the Sterling method: reward the curious into silence or bury them in bureaucracy. The community shock had long since faded into a dull, lingering ache for the families of the victims, who were now being told that the political sensitivity of the era made any further investigation impossible. The case was being treated as a relic of a different time, a casualty of the peace process, while the real perpetrator sat in a leather chair overlooking the Thames, sipping scotch and watching the city he had saved through fire. By 2008, the 1992 case was a ghost that only appeared in the periphery of late-night conversations among retired coppers. They spoke of the man in the tan trench coat like he was an urban legend, a phantom that Sterling had almost caught but who had slipped through his fingers. The legend of Sterling grew, the hero who was haunted by his only failure. It was a perfect narrative. He played the part of the grieving investigator with such conviction that he started to believe his own lies. He would visit the memorial site every year, laying a wreath for the courier, the father, and the secretary, his face a mask of somber reflection. This was the ultimate psychological horror of the cold case. The killer was the one presiding over the memorial, receiving the gratitude of the survivors for never giving up. But the cracks were starting to show in the foundation of Sterling's kingdom. Technology was advancing faster than his ability to suppress it. The yard's internal servers were being upgraded and old. Deleted files were being backed up to secure, off-site cloud storage that Sterling's department didn't fully control. A strange clue appeared in a routine data integrity check, a fragment of an encrypted communication from 1992 that had been flagged as system noise for 16 years. It was a short, coded burst of data sent from a police-issued radio to an unregistered receiver just seconds after the blast. The code didn't match IRA signals. It matched the internal encryption of the yard's own tactical units. Sterling didn't know this fragment existed, but the ghost was finally beginning to manifest in the machine. The lingering shock in the community was about to be reignited, though nobody knew it yet. The lost decade ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, Digital Whisper. Marcus Thorne, still in his self-imposed exile, had spent his years quietly digitizing his father's personal notes. Notes that mentioned a black car with government plates leaving the scene of the 1992 bombing through a restricted lane that Sterling had claimed was blocked. This was the mysterious disappearance of the perimeter, a hole in the ring of steel that was deliberately left open. Thorne knew he couldn't bring this to his superiors. He had to wait. He had to let the cold case stay cold until the right eyes were in the right place at the right time. The deadlock was a stalemate, but the clock was still ticking, and the man who thought he had buried the truth was about to find out that the earth in London doesn't hold its secrets forever. By 2012, the world had changed. The analog shadows where Arthur Sterling had built his empire were being illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving light of the digital revolution. London was preparing for the Olympics, and with it came a massive, unprecedented overhaul of the Metropolitan Police's archival systems. It was a project of immense scale. Millions of paper files, reel-to-reel tapes, and dusty evidence logs were being fed into the maw of a new, centralized server beast. For most, this was administrative housekeeping. For the cold case of the Baltic Exchange bombing, it was a resurrection. Sterling, now approaching the twilight of his career, viewed these servers as nothing more than storage units. He didn't understand that data, unlike paper, leaves a ghost even after you burn it. He didn't understand metadata. He didn't understand that while he had successfully orchestrated the mysterious disappearance of the physical evidence, he had left digital footprints in the mud that he didn't even know existed. Enter the new generation. The basement of a yard was no longer filled with smoke-stained detectives in trench coats. It was populated by data scientists and forensic analysts who spoke in code and saw crime scenes as algorithms. Among them was Maya Lin, a 26-year-old specialist in data recovery and legacy systems. She had no memory of the blast. She was a toddler when the glass rained down in 1992. To her, the Baltic Exchange bombing wasn't a tragedy or a memory. It was a dataset with an error. While migrating the unsolved terrorism files, her system flagged a temporal anomaly in the 1992 logbook. It was a strange clue, subtle enough to be missed by a human eye, but screamingly obvious to a machine. The digital timestamp on the initial crime scene report, the one filed by Sterling himself, predated the official time of the explosion by 4 minutes. It was a glitch. It had to be. That was the logical explanation. But Maya was trained to distrust logic when it came to legacy data. She dug deeper, peeling back the layers of the digitized file. What she found was a ghost edit. The report hadn't been written after the blast. It had been drafted before it, and then modified to fit the timeline. The deadlock that had held the case for 20 years cracked by a fraction of an inch. Someone had prepared the narrative of the investigation before the crime had even been committed. This wasn't just police work. This was playwriting. Maya sat in the glow of her monitors, the hum of the servers the only sound in the room, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She was looking at a premeditated cover-up, fossilized in the code. The community shock was still years away, but the tremor had started here, in this windowless room. Maya didn't know who Arthur Sterling was, not really. To her, he was just a name on a file, a lead investigator's signature. But as she ran a cross-reference on the lost encryption chip, the one Sterling had claimed was stolen, the system threw up a match. It wasn't in the evidence locker database, which had been purged. It was in a forgotten procurement ledger from 1991, a financial record of specialized communications equipment purchased by a shell company. The delivery address for that chip wasn't a terrorist safe house in Belfast. It was a private P.O. box in Kensington, registered to a consultancy firm that had been dissolved 3 months after the bombing. The name on the dissolution papers? A lawyer who had represented Sterling in a minor disciplinary hearing in the late 80s. The web was beginning to vibrate. The cold case was thawing, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The mysterious disappearance of the chip was a lie. It had never been lost. It had been returned to its owner. Maya was staring at a screen that told a story of impossible corruption, but she was alone. The hierarchy at the yard was still populated by men who had served with Sterling, men who revered him as a legend. If she took this up the chain of command, She risked being silenced just like the flower girl, just like the chemist, just like Marcus Thorne. She needed more. She needed this smoking gun that connected the digital ghost to the flesh and blood man. The investigation into the 1992 bombing had always been described as a hunt for a phantom. Now, Maya realized the phantom was the investigation itself. She began to quietly mirror the data to an external drive, a violation of protocol that could end her career, but the strange clue of the timestamps had hooked her. She spent her nights reconstructing the digital movements of Sterling's team in the week leading up to the blast. The new software allowed her to overlay the 1992 radio logs, which had been digitized from magnetic tape, onto a modern map of London. What she saw made her blood run cold. On the morning of the bombing, while the rest of the police force was being directed to the wrong sectors, one single unit was stationary, positioned perfectly to monitor the Baltic Exchange. That unit's call sign was assigned to Arthur Sterling. He had been there. He hadn't just arrived after the blast. He had been watching it happen. The realization was a physical blow. The hero of 1992, the man who had stood in the debris and vowed vengeance, had been the spectator of his own orchestrated disaster. The community shock that had defined a generation wasn't a terrorist attack. It was a stage play with real bodies. Maya looked at the screen, at the blue, representing Sterling's car, sitting motionless while the red radius of the explosion expanded on the map. It was the ultimate betrayal. The deadlock was broken, but the danger was just beginning. Maya Lin wasn't just holding a file, she was holding a grenade, and the pin had been pulled 20 years ago. The lost decade had allowed the dust to settle, but the digital age was a leaf blower. It was uncovering things that were meant to stay buried under the weight of time. The cold case was no longer about finding a bomber, it was about exposing a monster who wore a badge. As 2012 bled into the mid-2010s, the silence of the server room became the loudest place in London. The ghost in the machine was screaming, and finally, there was someone listening. The mysterious disappearance of justice was about to be corrected, bit by bite, until the picture of the man in the tan trench coat was sharp enough to hang in a courtroom. The year is 2015, and the silence of the cold case was about to be broken by the sound of two worlds colliding. Maya Lin, holding the digital smoking gun that proved Arthur Sterling's complicity, stood at a precipice. She knew that walking into the office of the commissioner with a hard drive full of glitches would be career suicide, or worse. The ring of steel that protected London also protected its architects, and Sterling was the cornerstone. She needed an ally, someone who remembered the smell of the smoke, someone whose career had bled out on the same altar where the evidence had been sacrificed. Her search through the personnel archives led her to one name, a name that had been flagged with a "do not promote" warning in the system: Marcus Thorne. The exiled detective, the man who had asked too many questions about a black car and a blocked lane, was now working a dead-end beat in a rainy coastal town, far away from the corridors of power. Image: a rainy, dimly lit meeting in a quiet pub or safe house, contrasting a laptop with an old notebook. The meeting didn't happen in a glass-walled office. It happened in the corner of a damp pub near the estuary, where the noise of the wind drowned out the conversation. It was a meeting of the analog and the digital, the old guard and the new. Thorne, gray-haired and cynical, looked at the young analyst with suspicion. He had spent 15 years trying to forget the Baltic Exchange, trying to convince himself that his gut instinct was wrong, that the mysterious disappearance of the evidence was just incompetence. But when Maya opened her laptop and overlaid the digital map of 1992 onto the table, showing the blue of Sterling's car stationary while the world exploded, Thorne didn't speak. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a tattered, weather-beaten notebook. He flipped to a page dated April 1992. There, scrawled in ink that had faded to rust, was a license plate number and a time. The time matched Maya's data to the second. The deadlock that had paralyzed the truth for decades shattered in that instant. The digital ghost and the paper memory had aligned perfectly. This was the birth of the Shadow Task Force, an operation that existed off the books, unfunded, unauthorized, and incredibly dangerous. They weren't just investigating a crime, they were investigating the institution itself. They worked in the margins of the day, meeting in safe houses, using encrypted servers that Maya built herself to bypass the Yard's monitoring software. Thorne brought the street knowledge, the understanding of how Sterling thought, how he manipulated people, how he used the community shock as a weapon. Maya brought the data, the ability to see through walls of time using metadata and recovered logs. Together, they began to reconstruct the 1992 investigation not as it was written in the official reports, but as it actually happened. They focused on the strange clue that had haunted the case from the start: the man in the tan trench coat. Thorne had always believed this man was an IRA operative. But Maya's deep dive into the 1992 payroll records revealed a chilling anomaly. On the day of the bombing, a freelance security consultant named Julian Vane had been paid a significant sum from a discretionary fund controlled directly by Sterling's office. Vane was a ghost in the system, a man with no fixed address, no tax records, but a military service record that was heavily redacted. Maya pulled his file from a decommissioned Ministry of Defense server. Vane wasn't a terrorist. He was a specialist in covert demolitions. He was the man Sterling had met the night before the blast. He was the man the flower girl had seen. The mysterious disappearance of Vane from the face of the earth after 1992 wasn't an escape. It was a cleanup operation. As the Shadow Task Force dug deeper, the atmosphere grew heavy with paranoia. They knew they were being watched, not by a person but by the system Sterling had built. Every search query Maya ran had to be masked. Every witness Thorne tried to recontact had to be approached with extreme caution. They were walking through a minefield where the mines were their own colleagues. The cold case was suddenly hot to the touch, radiating a radioactive danger. They found that Vane had died in a climbing accident in the Swiss Alps 3 months after the bombing. But Maya found the autopsy report in a hacked insurance database. The injuries weren't consistent with a fall. They were consistent with a high-velocity impact from a vehicle that had never been found. Vane hadn't fallen. He had been run down. And the beneficiary of his life insurance policy was a trust fund that, through a dozen shell companies, linked back to the same construction firm that had rebuilt the Baltic Exchange. The picture was becoming horrifyingly clear. Sterling hadn't just allowed the bomb. He had hired the bomber. He had used a state asset to blow a hole in the city, creating the chaos necessary to launch his own career and enrich his silent partners. The community shock of 1992 was a manufactured product, sold to the public by a man who is now a knight of the realm. The weight of this truth was crushing. Thorne and Maya sat in their makeshift war room, surrounded by screens and papers, realizing that they weren't just solving a murder. They were dismantling a history. The deadlock was over, but the endgame was approaching, and they were hopelessly outgunned. They needed a witness. A living, breathing human being who could testify to the connection between Sterling and Vane. The paper trail was damning, but in a court of law, against a national hero, they needed a voice. Thorne remembered the secretary, Sterling's old assistant, the one who had kept the diary. She was the loose end that Sterling, in his arrogance, had forgotten to cut. She was their strange clue, in human form. They tracked her down to a nursing home in the countryside, a woman whose memory was fading but whose conscience was still sharp. When Thorne walked into her room, she didn't look surprised. She looked relieved. "I wondered when you would come," she whispered. She had been waiting 23 years for someone to ask the right question. The tension of this phase of the investigation cannot be overstated. It was a race against time and against the inevitable countermove from Sterling. He was retired, but his eyes were still everywhere. If he caught wind of the Shadow Task Force, the mysterious disappearance of Maya and Thorne would be the next headline. They were operating in the belly of the beast, using the silence of the cold case as their cover. But as they gathered the final pieces of the puzzle, as they prepared to turn the ghost bombing into a solid indictment, they felt the shift in the air. The city was waking up. The truth was clawing its way out of the grave, and for Arthur Sterling, the long, comfortable winter of his immunity was coming to an end. The investigation was no longer a hunt. It was a trap, and they were waiting for the lion to walk in. The nursing home in the rolling hills of Kent was a place where memories went to fade, a quiet waiting room for the end of life, smelling of lavender and antiseptic. But inside room 304, the air was charged with a static electricity that belonged to a high-stakes interrogation room. Marcus Thorne sat across from Elizabeth Vance, the woman who had spent the 90s as the gatekeeper to Arthur Sterling's schedule. She was frail now, her hands trembling like dried leaves, but her eyes held a spark of defiance that age hadn't extinguished. She was the keeper of the cold case's heartbeat, the only living person who had seen the mask slip. When Thorne asked about the days leading up to the 1992 bombing, Elizabeth didn't speak immediately. She looked out the window at the gray sky, as if checking for storm clouds, or perhaps for the ghosts that had followed her here. Then, with a sigh that seemed to expel 30 years of poison, she reached under the mattress of her narrow bed. Image, close-up of an old, leather-bound diary being pulled from a hiding spot. She pulled out a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth by the touch of anxious fingers. This was the strange clue that no digital server could flag, the analog anchor in a sea of digital lies. It was her personal diary, a forbidden record of the unauthorized meetings and off-the-books cash transfers that she had witnessed, but was too terrified to question. She placed it in Thorne's hands like she was handling a live grenade. "He told me to burn it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He told me that if I ever wrote down the name Julian Vane, I would suffer a mysterious disappearance, just like the files." The room seemed to shrink. Thorne opened the book to the marked page. The date was 2 days before the blast. The entry was short, written in a hurried, jagged script. JV in office again. Back door. Cash payment from the Black Ops Contingency Fund. Yes, looks sick, sweaty. Says it's for the greater good. I don't believe him. There it was. The smoking gun wasn't ballistics, it was ink. The deadlock that had held the investigation in a stranglehold for decades dissolved in the presence of that handwritten note. It connected Sterling directly to the bomber, establishing premeditation and motive in a single sentence. Maya Lin, standing in the corner of the room, scanned the page with her phone, uploading it instantly to their encrypted cloud. But as the upload bar crept toward 100%, the atmosphere shifted. The hair on the back of Thorne's neck stood up, a primal instinct honed by years on the street. He looked out the window. A black sedan, identical to the ones used by the yard's internal security, had just pulled into the gravel driveway below. The engine was running. 2 men in dark suits were stepping out, not with the casual gait of visitors, but with the tactical precision of a cleanup crew. Sterling's network, that dormant spiderweb of surveillance, had felt the vibration of the diary being unearthed. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Thorne's chest. The community shock of a high-profile arrest was the goal, but if they didn't leave this room in the next 3 minutes, the only headline would be a tragic fire at a nursing home. "We have to go," Thorne said, his voice low and urgent. He didn't just take the photo. He took the diary, shoving it deep into his coat. Elizabeth grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't let him get away with it," she hissed, her fear transforming into a desperate plea for justice. Make him pay for the silence. It was a transfer of burden. She was giving them the weight of the cold case, freeing herself from the purgatory of her secret. Thorne nodded, a solemn vow passed between them, and then he and Maya were moving. They bypassed the main lobby, slipping out through the kitchen service entrance, just as the heavy oak doors of the nursing home swung open to admit the men in suits. The smell of rain and wet earth hit them as they sprinted toward Thorne's battered car, hidden behind a hedge of rhododendrons. As they peeled out onto the country road, Maya watched the rearview mirror. The black sedan didn't follow immediately. The cleaners were likely sweeping the room, looking for the book that was now speeding away at 80 miles per hour. They had the evidence, but the element of surprise was gone. The mysterious disappearance of the diary would trigger an alarm in Sterling's world. He would know that the ghost of 1992 had returned to haunt him. The drive back to London was a blur of adrenaline and paranoia. Every headlight in the mirror looked like an enemy. Every radio transmission sounded like a threat. They were carrying a piece of history that could topple a government, and the weight of it was terrifying. The deadlock was broken, but now the hunt was on. They weren't just detectives anymore, they were targets. Maya sat in the passenger seat, clutching the laptop, watching the digital copy of the diary propagate across multiple secure servers around the globe. "It's done," she said, her voice trembling. "It's backed up. They can't delete it now." But Thorne knew better. They couldn't delete the file, but they could delete the people who found it. The physical danger had just escalated from a possibility to a certainty. The community shock that was brewing would be unlike anything London had seen since the Blitz. They had this strange clue that tied the hero to the villain, the protector to the predator. But bringing it to light required one final, audacious step. They couldn't just leak it to the press. The press could be spun. Stories could be killed. They needed to force the hand of the justice system itself. They needed to walk into the lion's den, the high court, and present the evidence before Sterling could pull the strings to bury them. The diary was the key, but the lock was guarded by 30 years of corruption. As the skyline of London appeared on the horizon, glittering and cold, Thorne felt a grim determination settling in. The city looked peaceful, unaware that its foundation was about to crack. The cold case was coming to a boil, and the explosion this time wouldn't be made of Semtex. It would be made of truth. The city of London, usually a sprawling beast of indifference, felt different that night as Marcus Thorne and Maya Lynn crossed the boundary back into the capital. It was a sensation of tightening, as if the very streets were constricting around them. The cold case they carried in the back seat of the car, the battered diary, and the encrypted hard drive, was no longer just evidence. It was radioactive material. They knew they couldn't go home. Their apartments would be watched, their phones tapped, their digital lives dissected by the very surveillance state Arthur Sterling had helped to build. The Ring of Steel had turned inward, its cameras tracking them not as protectors, but as threats to the established order. They drove to a ghost location, an abandoned server farm in the Docklands that Maya had scouted years ago, a concrete husk where the hum of the city was muffled by thick walls and the smell of ozone. Inside this makeshift bunker, the atmosphere was one of calculated desperation. Maya set up a dead man switch. It was a piece of code designed to trigger a mass release of the diary and the financial logs to every major news outlet on the planet if she failed to enter a password every 6 hours. This was their insurance against a mysterious disappearance. If Sterling's cleaners found them, the truth would detonate automatically. Thorne watched her work, the glow of the screen illuminating the deep lines on his face. He was checking his old service revolver, a relic from a time when policing was about instinct, not algorithms. The deadlock of 34 years was over, but the most dangerous phase had just begun. They weren't fighting a criminal. They were fighting a monument. Sterling was woven into the fabric of the city's institutions. To tear him down was to risk tearing down the public's faith in justice itself. Meanwhile, in a high-rise penthouse overlooking the Thames, Arthur Sterling received the call he had dreaded for 3 decades. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and terrifyingly brief. "The package was acquired before we arrived. The target is mobile." Sterling didn't scream. He didn't throw the phone. He simply walked to the window and looked out at the lights of London, the city he treated as his chessboard. The strange clue of the diary, the one loose thread he had failed to snip, was now a noose tightening around his neck. He knew exactly who had it. Marcus Thorne. The past. The man who wouldn't let the past die. A cold, reptilian fury settled over him. He activated his assets, not the police, but the private contractors, the men who operated in the gray zones where the law didn't reach. The order was simple: contain the leak. The community shock of a scandal had to be avoided at all costs, even if it meant turning the streets into a war zone. Back in the bunker, the plan was being finalized. They couldn't go to the police commissioner. He was a golf buddy of Sterling's. They couldn't go to the press yet. The story was too big, too unbelievable without an official stamp. They had to aim higher. They had to go to the Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, a woman known for her ironclad integrity and her dislike of the old boys club at the Yard. It was a gamble. If she was compromised, or if she didn't believe the strange clue of the diary, Thorne and Maya would be walking into a cell, charged with theft and treason. but it was the only play they had. They prepared a dossier, a physical manifestation of the cold case, binding the digital logs and the handwritten confession into a single, undeniable narrative. The tension in London the next morning was palpable, though the public didn't know why. There was a heaviness in the air, up before the storm, static that pricked the skin. Police sirens seemed to wail more frequently. Unmarked cars idled at key intersections. The Shadow Task Force moved through this landscape like smugglers, navigating the back alleys and service roads, avoiding the automatic number plate recognition cameras that were now scanning for Thorne's car. They were ghosts in their own city, hunted by the very system they were trying to save. Every red light felt like a trap. Every delay felt like a setup. The deadlock had broken, but the friction of the collapse was generating heat. As they approached the secure offices of the DPP, the reality of what they were about to do hit them. They were about to accuse a national hero of mass murder. They were about to tell the world that the mysterious disappearance of justice in 1992 was a deliberate act of state-sponsored terror. The community shock that would follow would be seismic. Thorne looked at Maya. She was pale, her hands gripping the dossier so hard her knuckles were white. "Are you ready?" he asked. She didn't answer with words. She just nodded, a sharp, jerky movement. They weren't just partners anymore. They were the last line of defense for the victims who had been silenced for too long. They parked the car in a blind spot 2 blocks away and moved on foot, blending into the morning commute. The crowd was their shield. But Sterling's eyes were everywhere. A CCTV camera swiveled as they passed, its mechanical iris focusing on Thorne's face. In the control room across the city, an alert flashed red. Target acquired. The call went out to the interception team. They were minutes away. The race to the steps of the prosecution office became a literal sprint against time. The cold case was burning hot, and the final collision between the lie and the truth was about to happen on the pavement of central London. The ghosts of 1992 were running with them, urging them forward, whispering that this was the moment the smoke finally cleared. The pavement of Victoria Street felt like a treadmill under their feet, the heavy glass doors of the Crown Prosecution Service looming in the distance like the gates of a sanctuary, yet seemingly moving further away with every step. Marcus Thorne and Maya Lynn were running, not with the athletic grace of sprinters, but with the desperate, lung-burning scramble of prey. Behind them, the screech of tires cut through the morning drone of London traffic, a sharp, violent sound that didn't belong to a commuter bus. It was the black SUV, Sterling's interception team, mounting the curb 50 yards back, scattering pedestrians like pigeons. The ring of steel had become a noose, and it was tightening in the final seconds of this 34-year marathon. Thorne could hear the engine revving, a mechanical roar that promised a mysterious disappearance if they didn't make the threshold. He shoved Maya forward, his hand on her back, his old instinct screaming that the hit was imminent. "Don't look back," he yelled, his voice ragged. "Just get to the doors." They hit the entrance with the force of a battering ram, collapsing into the lobby just as the heavy, bullet-resistant glass slid shut behind them. Outside, the black SUV screeched to a halt, inches from the barrier. 2 men in suits stepped out, their eyes locked on Thorne through the glass, cold and devoid of humanity. They lingered for a heartbeat, a terrifying moment where the law of the jungle met the law of the land, before retreating back into the vehicle. They knew the line had been crossed. The cold case had officially entered the building. Inside, the silence was deafening, broken only by the heavy breathing of the 2 fugitives and the shocked murmurs of the security guards who had hands on their holsters. Thorne flashed his retired warrant card, a piece of plastic that felt heavier than lead. "Director's office," he rasped, sweat dripping from his gray brow.
"Now."
"This is a Code 0 national security threat." The journey to the top floor was a blur of elevators and skeptical secretaries, but the sheer, undeniable gravity of Thorne's presence, a man carrying the weight of the dead, pushed doors open. When they finally stood before the Director of Public Prosecutions, a woman named Eleanor Vance, who was known for her steely composure, the room felt like a vacuum.
Thorne didn't speak.
He simply placed the tattered, leather-bound diary on her polished mahogany desk. Next to it, Maya placed the encrypted hard drive. The Baltic Exchange, Thorne said, his voice trembling with the release of 3 decades of pressure. It wasn't a ghost. It was Sterling. The name hung in the air like a curse. Vance looked at the diary, then at the frantic, desperate faces of the 2 detectives. She opened the book to the marked page. As she read the entry, the handwriting of a terrified woman documenting the betrayal of a hero, her expression shifted from professional detachment to a profound, horrified realization. The strange clue that had been buried for a generation was now screaming in her hands. The shift in the room was tectonic. Vance didn't ask for verification. The authenticity of the terror in those pages was unmistakable. She picked up her secure line. "Get me the commissioner," she ordered, her voice ice-cold. "And get me a tactical unit. Not from the city. Get me the Met's Internal Affairs Special Operations. We are executing a warrant." The deadlock of the investigation shattered in that sentence. The machinery of justice, so long rusted shut by Sterling's influence, groaned into action. It was a terrifyingly fast pivot. Within minutes, the building was in lockdown, and the order was moving down the chain of command, bypassing Sterling's cronies, striking directly at the heart of the lie. Maya slumped into a chair, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. They had done it. They had delivered the bomb to the only people who could defuse it. Cut to the suburbs of Surrey. It was a Tuesday, 34 years to the day of the original blast. The sky was a brilliant, indifferent blue. Arthur Sterling was in his garden, a sprawling, manicured Eden that he had bought with the blood money of 1992. He was pruning his prize-winning roses, the shears making a sharp, rhythmic snip, snip, snip that echoed the ticking of a clock. He knew they were coming. His phone had gone silent 10 minutes ago, a sign that his network had been severed. He didn't run. Where would a man like him go? His face was on statues. His name was on wings of hospitals. He was a monument, and monuments don't run. They crumble. He adjusted his cufflink, brushed a speck of dirt from his trousers, and looked toward the gate. The convoy didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived with a silent, lethal precision. 6 armored vehicles blocked the street. Dozens of officers in full tactical gear poured out, their movements sharp and coordinated. These weren't the men Sterling used to command. These were the new guard, the generation that didn't owe him anything. They moved through the gate, weapons raised, flanking the garden. The contrast was jarring, the violence of the state descending on a peaceful English garden. Sterling didn't raise his hands immediately. He looked at the lead officer, a young woman who looked remarkably like the courier who had died in the blast. For a second, the ghost of 1992 stared back at him. Then he dropped the shears. They hit the stone path with a clang that sounded like a prison door slamming shut. "Arthur Sterling," the officer announced, her voice ringing clear over the sound of wind in the trees. "I am arresting you for conspiracy to commit murder, high treason, and acts of terrorism." The handcuffs clicked, a metallic sound that seemed to echo across the entire country. It was the closing of the circle. The man in the tan trench coat, the man who had walked away from the smoke, was finally stopped. He was led away, his head high, his eyes empty, past the neighbors who peered through twitching curtains, witnessing the community shock unfold in real time. The hero was leaving in chains. The news broke 20 minutes later, and it broke like a tidal wave. London 1992 cold case solved. Arrest shocks community. The headline flashed across every smartphone, every television, every digital billboard in Piccadilly Circus. The reaction was visceral. People stopped in the street, staring at their screens, their mouths open in disbelief. The narrative they had lived with for 34 years, the story of the brave detective and the elusive terrorist, was being rewritten in front of their eyes. It wasn't just a news story, it was a psychological earthquake. The mysterious disappearance of justice had been solved, but the answer was more horrifying than the mystery. The protector was the predator. In the pubs of the East End, where the memory of the blast was still a scar on the neighborhood, the silence was profound. Old men who remembered the shaking ground put down their pints. They looked at the face of Sterling on the TV, the face they had trusted, and felt a burning, righteous anger. The deadlock was over, but the betrayal was fresh. The strange clue of the encryption chip, the missing files, the silenced witnesses, it all made sense now. The puzzle was complete, and the picture was a portrait of pure corruption. For the families of the victims, the news came as a physical shock. The daughter of the father, who died tying his shoe, received the call while she was at work. She collapsed, not in grief, but in a shaking, sobbing relief that felt like a purge. The monster wasn't a faceless ghost anymore. He had a name. He had a face. And he was in a cell. The community shock rippled outward, turning into a global story. The ghost of the Baltic Exchange had been exorcised. Back in the DPP's office, Thorne and Maya watched the news feed. They didn't celebrate. There were no high fives, no champagne. They just sat there, exhausted, watching the world try to process the truth they had carried alone in the dark. Thorne looked at his hands, still shaking slightly. He had fulfilled the silent promise he made to his father. The cold case was closed. But as he looked at Sterling's face on the screen, he knew the trial would be the real war. The arrest was just the beginning of the reckoning. The smoke had cleared, but the ashes were going to choke the establishment for years to come. The heavy steel door of interview room 1 slammed shut, sealing the atmosphere inside a vacuum of white noise and humming fluorescent lights. This was the same room where Arthur Sterling had broken hundreds of men, peeling back their defenses until they were raw and weeping. Now, he sat on the other side of the bolted table, his hands resting calmly on the cold metal, his posture as rigid as a statue. He was in a bespoke suit that looked out of place against the sterile, scuffed walls. For 6 hours, he hadn't spoken a word. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't asked for water. He simply stared at the two-way mirror, watching his own reflection with a detached curiosity, as if he were studying a specimen in a jar. The deadlock of the interrogation was absolute. He knew the game better than the people trying to play it against him. He knew that silence was a weapon, and he was wielding it with the precision of a surgeon. On the other side of the glass, the director of public prosecutions and the head of the Internal Affairs Task Force watched with growing frustration. They had the evidence, but they needed the narrative. They needed him to say it. They needed the why. But Sterling was a fortress. Then, the door opened, and Marcus Thorne walked in. He looked tired, his coat rumpled, carrying the weight of 34 years of obsession. He didn't carry a file. He didn't carry a laptop. He carried a small, leather-bound book. He sat down opposite Sterling. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, a wire pulled tight between two poles of history. Sterling's eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, as he recognized the man he had tried to bury. "Marcus," Sterling said, his voice smooth, devoid of fear. "You look terrible. Still chasing ghosts." Thorne didn't bite. He placed the diary on the table. The cover was worn, the leather cracked. Sterling's gaze dropped to the book, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his armor. He recognized it. It was Elizabeth's, the secretary he had trusted, the quiet woman he thought was too simple to understand his grand design. "She didn't burn it, Arthur," Thorne said softly. "She kept it. Every meeting, every payoff, every time Julian Vane walked into your office." The name Vane hit the room like a physical blow. The strange clue that Sterling thought he had erased from existence was now sitting between them, a paper grenade. Sterling's hands tightened slightly on the table. The mysterious disappearance of the evidence had failed because of human sentiment, the one variable he couldn't calculate. "You think a senile old woman's scribbles will hold up in court?" Sterling sneered, attempting to regain the high ground. "It's hearsay. It's fantasy." Thorne leaned forward. "We didn't just find the book, Arthur. We found the money. And we found the footage." He signaled to the mirror. A monitor on the wall flickered to life. It showed a digitally restored clip from 1992, enhanced by Maya Lin's algorithms. It showed the side entrance of the Baltic Exchange, minutes before the blast. A man in a tan trench coat, Julian Vane, walked out, paused, and looked directly at a parked car across the street. He gave a thumbs up. The camera zoomed in on the car. Through the windshield, clearer than day, was the face of Arthur Sterling. He wasn't looking at the bomber, he was looking at his watch. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of resistance, it was the silence of ruin. Sterling stared at the screen, his face draining of color. The cold case wasn't just solved, it was dissected. The ghost wasn't a myth, it was a partner. Thorne watched the transformation. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard rage. Sterling didn't look guilty. He looked insulted. He looked like a grandmaster who had lost to a novice. The community shock outside was nothing compared to the storm raging behind Sterling's eyes. He realized the game was over. There was no way out. The ring of steel had collapsed on top of him. "You don't understand," Sterling finally whispered, his voice trembling not with fear, but with intensity. "You look at that screen, and you see a crime. I see necessity." Necessity. Thorne asked, his voice rising. 3 people died, Arthur. A father. A girl on her first day. For what? Sterling looked up, his eyes burning with a terrifying, fanatical conviction. For the city, he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. London was weak. We were losing. The budget was being slashed, the surveillance grid was a joke, the politicians were asleep at the wheel. We needed a wake-up call. We needed a shock to the system so profound that they would give us the tools we needed to protect them. He leaned in, his face inches from Thorne's. "I didn't kill them, Marcus. I sacrificed them. And look at the result. Look at the safety we've enjoyed for 30 years. I built the shield that let you sleep at night. I am the reason London is standing." The confession hung in the air, toxic and heavy. He wasn't denying the act, he was justifying it. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a visionary who had the courage to do the hard thing. The controlled tragedy was his masterpiece, a blood sacrifice to the god of security. Thorne looked at him with a mixture of horror and pity. This was the monster at the heart of the cold case, not a chaotic terrorist, but a cold, calculating bureaucrat who believed he was above morality. "You're not a savior, Arthur," Thorne said quietly, standing up. "You're just a man who wanted power and used dead bodies to climb the stairs." Sterling laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "History will judge me differently. They'll see the peace I bought them." "No," Thorne said, turning to the door. "They'll just see the bill." Thorne walked out, leaving Sterling alone with his reflection. The confession was recorded. The strange clue of the diary had led to the unraveling of a mind that had twisted duty into madness. The deadlock was broken forever. Outside the room, the DPP was pale. They had what they needed. The community shock would turn into a boiling rage when this tape was played in court. The families would finally know that their loved ones weren't casualties of war. They were pawns in a career move. The interrogation was over, but the echo of Sterling's justification, "I sacrificed them," would haunt everyone who heard it. The mystery was solved, but the darkness it revealed was bottomless. The trial was the event of the century, a spectacle that turned the gray stone facade of the Old Bailey into the epicenter of a national reckoning. The streets outside were a sea of cameras, satellite trucks, and protesters, a chaotic ocean of noise that washed up against the walls of justice. But inside court number 1, the atmosphere was hermetically sealed, a vacuum of breathless anticipation where the air itself felt heavy with the weight of 34 years of lies. Arthur Sterling stood in the glass-enclosed dock, not as a broken man, but with the terrifying composure of a fallen king. He wore his medals on the lapel of his suit, a visual challenge to the jury, a silent reminder of the hero he had played for decades. The deadlock that had kept the truth in the dark was about to be broken by the gavel, and the world was watching. The prosecution didn't begin with legal jargon. They began with the names. The courier, the father, the secretary. They projected the faces of the victims onto the massive screens, faces frozen in 1992, forever young, forever unaware that their deaths were a line item in a budget proposal. The lead prosecutor, a sharp, relentless woman named Sarah Gentry pointed a finger at Sterling that trembled with controlled rage. "This is not a trial about a failure of policing," she declared, her voice echoing off the oak panels. "This is a trial about the mysterious disappearance of humanity." She laid out the timeline of the cold case with forensic precision, weaving the digital threads discovered by Maya Lin into a tapestry of betrayal. The courtroom gasped as the strange clue of the encryption chip was finally explained, not as a piece of terrorist tradecraft, but as a receipt for treason. When Marcus Thorne took the stand, the silence in the room was absolute. He looked older, tired, but his voice was steady as he recounted the years of gaslighting, the ghost leads he was forced to chase, and the moment he realized the enemy was sitting in the office above him. He described the Ring of Steel, not as a shield, but as a cage where Sterling controlled who entered and who left. He spoke of the blocked lane, the stationary car, the deliberate blindness of the surveillance grid. It was a devastation of the Sterling myth. The jury looked from the rugged, honest face of the old detective to the cold, impassive mask of the defendant. The community shock was palpable in the gallery. You could hear the shifting of bodies, the stifled sobs of the families who were finally hearing the story of how their loved ones were sold. But the emotional climax came with the testimony of Elizabeth Vance. She was wheeled into the courtroom, frail and small, clutching a handkerchief. When the prosecutor asked her to read from the diary, the strange clue that had survived the purge, her voice was barely a whisper. But as she read the entry about the cash payment to Julian Vane, her voice gained strength. He said it was for the greater good. He said eggs must be broken. But he was shaking. He knew it was murder. Sterling didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. The betrayal of his most loyal servant was the one wound he couldn't hide. The jury saw it. They saw the flicker of shame, quickly buried under layers of arrogance. The diary wasn't just evidence, it was a mirror, and Sterling couldn't stand the reflection. The defense tried to pivot. They didn't argue innocence. The digital trail was too thick, the financial records too damning. Instead, they argued context. They painted 1992 as a war zone, a time of desperate measures. They tried to frame Sterling as a man who made an impossible choice to secure the funding and powers that saved thousands in the years that followed. It was a grotesque, Machiavellian defense, the idea that the cold case was actually a cold calculation that benefited the greater good. It was a gamble designed to appeal to the cynics, to the people who believed that safety required a butcher. But the prosecution destroyed it with a single piece of evidence: the financial records. They showed that the security contracts awarded after the bombing didn't just go to the police. They went to shell companies that padded Sterling's offshore accounts. This wasn't patriotism, it was profit. The greater good was a bank balance. The closing arguments were a battle for the soul of the justice system. "If you let this man walk," Gentry told the jury, "you are saying that the badge is a license to kill. You are saying that the mysterious disappearance of the truth is acceptable if the lie is comfortable." The jury was out for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the tension in the room was a physical force, a static charge that made the hair on your arms stand up. The foreman, a young man who wasn't even born when the bomb went off, stood up. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked at the families. Guilty. The word hung in the air for a second, then crashed down like the bomb itself. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to murder. High treason. Perversion of the course of justice. The courtroom erupted. It wasn't a cheer. It was a release, a collective exhale of 34 years of holding breath. The families embraced, tears streaming down faces etched with decades of grief. The deadlock was shattered. The untouchable, Arthur Sterling, the architect of the modern police state, slumped in his chair. For the first time, the mask slipped completely. He looked small. He looked old. He looked like exactly what he was, a criminal in a suit. The judge's sentencing remarks were scathing. He called Sterling's actions a stain on the history of this country and a betrayal of every officer who has ever worn the uniform. He sentenced Sterling to a whole life order, meaning he would die in prison. There would be no parole, No early release, no quiet retirement. The hero was erased. As the guards moved to take him down to the cells, Sterling stopped. He turned to the gallery. He looked for a friendly face, a supporter, someone who still believed the lie. He found none. He saw only the cold, hard stare of a city that had finally woken up. The community shock had transformed into closure. The London 1992 cold case was no longer a mystery. It was a history lesson in the dangers of unchecked power. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Guilty. Sterling goes down, flashed on the screens. The crowd cheered, a raw, guttural sound of vindication. Marcus Thorne and Maya Lynn walked out of the Old Bailey side by side. They didn't stop for the cameras. They didn't give interviews. They walked past the microphones, past the shouting reporters, and into the cool London evening. They had done their job. The ghost was caught. The shadow was lifted. The impact of the trial reverberated far beyond the courtroom. It triggered a massive inquiry into the Black Ops units of the 90s. It led to the reopening of a dozen other cold cases that had been conveniently solved during Sterling's tenure. The strange clue of the diary became a symbol of the power of the truth, a reminder that even the smallest voice can topple the biggest giant. The mysterious disappearance of evidence was no longer a valid excuse. New protocols were put in place, the Sterling laws, ensuring that digital archives could never be purged by a single hand again. But for the families, the victory was quieter. It was the empty chair at the dinner table that would never be filled, but now, at least, the reason for the emptiness wasn't a question mark. It was a period. The lingering shock over the years finally began to dissipate, replaced by the slow, painful process of true healing. They went to the memorial site the next day. They laid new flowers. And for the first time in 34 years, the air didn't feel heavy. The smoke had truly cleared. Arthur Sterling sits in a cell in Belmarsh, surrounded by the very criminals he spent a lifetime condemning. He is a ghost in his own life now, haunting a concrete box, left with nothing but the memory of the explosion he orchestrated. The deadlock of his conscience is the only prison that matters. The case is closed, the file is stamped, and the city moves on a little wiser, a little more cynical, but finally free of the lie. The story of the London 1992 bombing is no longer a tragedy of the unknown. It is a tragedy of the known, a scar that proves the city survived the man who tried to break it. Today, the site near the Baltic Exchange has a new atmosphere. The glass of the modern buildings reflects a city that is finally breathing again, though the breath is ragged, catching in the throat like a survivor learning to trust the air after a fire. The media circus that surrounded the Old Bailey has packed up its tents. The satellite trucks have dispersed, leaving only the wet pavement and the pigeons to reclaim the streets. But while the cameras have moved on to the next tragedy, the frequency of the city has shifted. You can feel it in the way the morning commuters walk past the police officers on patrol, not with the blind trust of the 90s, nor with the cynical fear of the deadlock years, but with a sharp, vigilant awareness. The cold case of 1992 didn't just solve a crime. It broke a spell. The illusion of the infallible protector was shattered, replaced by a harder, colder reality. Trust is something that must be earned every single day and verified by the watching eyes of a million digital witnesses. The legacy of the investigation into Arthur Sterling is now etched into the very stones of New Scotland Yard. They call them the Sterling Protocols, a draconian set of new laws regarding the handling of digital evidence and cold case archives. The era of the mysterious disappearance is over. Every file, every log, every scrap of metadata is now mirrored instantly to independent servers, watched over by a new department of civilian oversight. It is a system built on paranoia, yes, but it is a paranoia born of survival. The strange clue that Maya Lynn found, the glitch in the timestamp, is now the standard for how justice is measured. The machine does not forget, and it does not forgive. And speaking of Maya, she didn't take the promotion they offered her. She didn't want the corner office or the press conferences. She returned to the basement, to the hum of the servers and the glow of the screens. She understands now that the true front line isn't on the streets, it's in the code. She is the new guardian, the silent watcher in the dark, ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, can ever edit the past again. For the families of the courier, the father, and the secretary, the end of the trial brought a quiet that was almost deafening. The adrenaline of the fight, the community shock, the rage, it all drained away, leaving behind the simple, unadorned grief that had been waiting for 34 years to be felt properly. They gathered one last time at the memorial plaque, not as protesters demanding answers, but as mourners finally allowed to say goodbye. The daughter of the father, now a grown woman with children of her own, traced her finger over his name carved in the stone. It felt different now. It wasn't a question mark anymore. It was a period. The man who killed him was rotting in a cell, and the man who ordered it was erased from history. The deadlock of their pain had been unlocked, and while the door would never fully close on the loss, the draft was no longer freezing them to the bone. And then there is Marcus Thorne, the man who carried the ghost of 1992 on his back until his spine nearly snapped. On the one-year anniversary of the verdict, he took a walk through the city of London. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the light turns golden and the shadows stretch long across the Thames. He walked past the skyscrapers that had risen from the ashes of the 90s, the glass towers that symbolized money and power, the very things Sterling had killed for. Thorne felt like a visitor from another time, an analog man in a high-definition world. He wore his old coat, the one that smelled of stale tobacco and rain, a shield against a city he saved but no longer recognized. He wasn't a detective anymore. He was just a man. He stopped at the site of the blast. The crater was long gone, filled in with concrete and commerce, but Thorne could still see it. He could still see the smoke. He could still smell the cordite. He could still hear the sirens wailing in the distance, a ghostly echo that would never truly fade. But this time, the memory didn't hurt. It didn't have teeth. He looked at the spot where he had stood with Arthur Sterling all those years ago, where the lie had been born amidst the debris. He imagined Sterling there, young and ambitious, making the choice that would damn him. And he felt a strange, pitying clarity. Sterling had wanted to be a legend. He had wanted to be the man who held the city together. In the end, he became the crack that almost tore it apart. Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, leather-bound diary. He had kept it after the trial, a talisman of the truth. He looked at it for a long moment, the pages yellowed and brittle. It belonged to history now, not to him. He walked over to the memorial bench where a few withered flowers lay. He didn't leave the diary there. That would be poetic, but reckless. Instead, he simply sat down. He closed his eyes and listened to the city. He heard the rush of the buses, the chatter of tourists, the distant hum of the underground. He heard life. The bomb had gone off, the people had died, the betrayal had happened, and yet, London was still here. It was noisy, messy, corrupt, and beautiful. It had survived the Blitz, it had survived the IRA, and it had survived Arthur Sterling. The community shock had healed into a scar, tough and white. The strange clue had been solved. The mysterious disappearance of justice had been corrected. Thorne realized that his watch was finally over. The Shadow Task Force was disbanded, the safe houses emptied, the burner phones destroyed. There were no more secrets to hunt. He stood up, his knees popping, feeling the weight of his age. He looked at the sky, where the first stars were struggling to shine through the city glow. He thought of his father, the first responder who had died never knowing the truth. "We got him, Dad," he whispered to the wind. "We got him." As he walked away, merging into the crowd, he didn't look back. The man in the tan trench coat, the phantom, the bomber, the ghost, was gone. The only thing left was the truth, standing tall and naked in the cold light. The case is closed. The file is stamped. The smoke has finally, truly cleared. And though the memory of that Tuesday morning will vibrate in the stones of London forever, it is no longer a haunting. It is a reminder. A reminder that in the darkest corners of the cold case, where the shadows are deepest and the silence is loudest, the truth is always there, waiting for someone brave enough to strike a match. This is the end of the line for the investigation into the Baltic Exchange bombing. The story belongs to the archives now. But for those who lived it, for those who fought the deadlock and broke the wall of silence, the echo remains. It whispers a warning to the future. Power without accountability is a bomb waiting to go off, and the only thing that can defuse it is the relentless, stubborn, inconvenient truth. Good night, London. Sleep well. The watchmen are finally awake.